The Changing Pace in Canadian Education by Northrop Frye. The reward of surviving in universities is to become an educator, and the more technical and administrative problems of education have been forcing themselves on me in the last 4 years or so involuntarily. One thus finds oneself in the constant position of having to make pronouncements on liberal education and related topics. These are easy enough to make, being like sermons except that they have no text and no context. But it is curious that there are so many pronouncements of this kind, and yet that there should be relatively little attempt to define the function of the university in contemporary society, particularly at a time when it is obviously changing its relation to that society. Many areas of thought today are left undeveloped through a kind of wait-and-see policy. What, for example, is the use of trying to work out a coherent political theory for a world that may blow to pieces at any moment? The attitude of the chief fireman at a burning rubber factory, "We'd best let it burn up a bit so we can see what we're doing," is one that we find everywhere today, not least in the intellectual attitudes of students. And as a major revolution in the function of the modern university is clearly only beginning, it is natural that speeches about that function should be ritual rather than prophetic, concerned more with the habitual than with the impending. The university is becoming so powerful and influential in society that legislatures, churches, sport-conscious alumni, and opinionated philanthropists are no longer able to bully it with the same old zest. In this very increase of freedom, however, there is a subtle threat of a new kind. The public has become much more interested in education at all levels, including the university level. And when the public becomes interested in something, it demands as payment for its interest the right of breathing down necks. What academic freedom the university has so far been able to preserve has been preserved partly by a general lack of such public interest. It may have to be preserved by more positive means in the future. If so, it will be well to be clear in our minds what academic freedom consists of and why its defense is important under the new social conditions. At the same time, we have steadily increasing swarms of young people, earnest in their aims and wondering, justifiably wondering, what is expected of them by the university in particular and by society in general. Not unreasonably, they want to know what the university can guarantee to do for them, if anything, and they often find themselves baffled by the situations that they encounter. They have been, through elementary and secondary schools, taught with varying degrees of efficiency. At university, they sometimes encounter, especially in the bigger universities, instructors who can't teach and are proud of it. They discover that their university instructors are given no training in teaching. They learn to teach in much the same way that a dog learns to swim, and are not promoted for their ability in teaching, but for other qualities altogether. I have not myself any sympathy whatever with the instructor who regards it as a status symbol to be a bad teacher. And certainly in my field of literary criticism, it is hardly possible to achieve genuine excellence as a critic without being a teacher as well. At the same time, once the student crosses the boundary line between high school and university, he leaves a place which is primarily a teaching institution and enters one which is not, and some of his natural expectation of being taught in the same way as before is bound to be disappointed. Still less, of course, does the university have anything to do with any such aims as the improving of one's mind. Yet here again, the university needs a clear sense of its own function in order to explain to the student what the limits of its teaching powers are. The traditional view of the university is that it is a function of the church, the classical exposition of that view being Cardinal Newman's in the 19th century. I happen not to believe in this account of the university's origin and function. I do not think the university is especially a medieval idea, or that it is, at least now, in any respect, a function of the church. Yet the university does resemble the church in one respect, that it stands for some kind of detachment from the moral standards of its community. It needs the sense of such a detachment in proportion as it becomes involved with its community. The older type of scholar, commemorated in the comic strip figure of the absent-minded professor, did exist in 19th century universities, discovered by his scout in the evening with a pile of books over his table and the lunch which he had forgotten to eat buried beneath the books. But the professor becomes managerial like other professional men in contemporary society, and there is danger of his acquiring the kind of moral insensitivity which goes with his new place in society. I am thinking of a social scientist I was talking to recently who had just been to a conference, I think in Bermuda, in a luxurious hotel where the theme of the discussion was assistance to underdeveloped nations. He remarked that the amount of money spent there on liquor alone would appreciably raise the standard of living in South Indian Village for some years. This is the kind of thing I mean by moral insensitivity. If the university, like so much of the rest of our society, falls into the habit of rationalizing its own prosperity as a kind of virtue, it will have been kidnapped by that society and will have betrayed its specific function. There is a well-known phrase popularized by Chaucer, to make a virtue of necessity, but it is equally pretentious to make a virtue of freedom, if one interprets freedom as the possession of middle-class comforts. Whenever I think about the approaching change in the social context of universities, I begin by contrasting the university today with its position when I was an undergraduate about 30 years ago. At that time, it was the Depression, and the younger university instructor had approximately the social status of a door-to-door pencil salesman. There was even competition for students. I remember talking with a sardonic young woman at a reception desk in New York who told me that after she had been graduated, she got a letter inviting her to enter the graduate school. This had flattered her considerably because she was by no means a model student, but she soon realized that there was an economic motivation involved. This had given her a view of society which convinced her that, in her own words, education's the biggest damn racket there is, except maybe religion. The young instructor, if hired, was paid rather less than the driver of a delivery truck, and was also told that even to earn that, he would have to go through the long, laborious, and expensive business of acquiring a Ph.D., or else. Having acquired the Ph.D., he would then have to produce a regular series of publications under the general motto of publish or perish until, somewhere around middle age, he would finally be given tenure, which to an American academic was not unlike an appointment to the Senate for a Canadian politician. The situation of the instructor today is a very different one. Instead of having a status of a door-to-door pencil salesman, he now has, or soon will have, approximately the social status of a free taxi in a pouring rain. It is becoming obvious that the cumbersome routine of the Ph.D., followed by the series of articles in learned journals, is no longer necessary to support his wife and children. If he shows competence in teaching in a university classroom, no university in its senses is going to let him go, whatever degrees he has. His economic motivation for becoming a scholar and producing articles in learned journals will be, not to avoid getting fired, but to become known in other universities so that he may leave his job for a better one. Then again, universities do a great deal of worrying, and rightly, about the coming population explosion of students. For some reason, we hear less about another problem which is even further advanced, a population explosion in scholarship. There will be a vast increase in the number of bright young men, all busily writing and producing articles. And as a result, the general field of, say, English, which I know best, is bound to become specialized to an unprecedented degree. I can visualize within my own time departments of English in which the professor of English will be the professor of Dryden, and underneath him will be lecturers in Lycidas, fellows in Othello, and readers of Blake prophecies. There's already one learned journal in Canada devoted entirely to the scholarly organization of Canadian literature, and within a short time we may look forward to definitive scholarly editions of Beautiful Joe and Anne of Green Gables, together with definitive biographies of their authors. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, the University of Toronto Press produced relatively little in the way of books, tended in fact to disgorge the President's report early in March and call it a year. Today, of course, it is a first-rate press with a first-rate publishing list, and similar presses are now being established in universities in Montreal. We take this development of the university press to be normal as a university grows, but we have to multiply that by about 200 to realize what is happening, because there are probably about that many ambitious universities all developing presses, all with distinguished lists and with people to write books for them. I've had a good many students who are now engaged in scholarship, and a constant shower of off-prints keeps pouring on my desk. A few of them were people who had little vocation for university work, and whenever I get an off-print from one of them, I discover the existence of a new learned journal which I had not previously heard of. But of course, that will in its turn become one of the recognized journals. What all this means, among other things, is that the sense which has always been endemic in the university, a sense of a universal mutual unintelligibility among departments, is clearly going to increase as well. As a member of Section 2 of the Royal Society, which covers the humanities and social sciences, I find myself unable to read even the abstracts of the papers contributed to Section 3, which is mathematics and physics. For a time, I thought that exclamation marks in the equations of the mathematicians represented some enthusiasm for the beauty of their subject, and that there was at least that much communication possible. But I was undeceived on this point. I question whether there is anything at all to be done about this situation. I do not warm up to the notion of integrating or coordinating subjects. I can understand the statement that literature and mathematics are both attempts to communicate, but I feel that any such subject as communications, designed to communicate between them, tends to become enclosed in its own special language, and merely to add one more unintelligible voice. I have similar reservations about attempts to base an entire educational curriculum on a synoptic view of the heritage of Western culture. There are colleges devoted to the study of great books which attempt to give the student a coordinated training in humanities, mathematics, and at least the history of science. These projects strike me as, to some extent, efforts of remedial education, which are significant partly as indicating a breakdown of the organized curriculum between kindergarten teaching, which is relatively efficient, and university education, which, if often inefficient as teaching, is relatively well informed. In a properly organized educational system in which the sequence made consistent sense from kindergarten through to the end of high school, the student would have acquired, in however immature a way, some sense of the synoptic view of culture which the curriculum of great books designs to give. When he entered university, he would have earned the right to specialize, and it is my experience that the majority of exceptionally keen and brilliant students at university want to specialize. University courses need not be afraid of dealing in separate disciplines intelligible only to those who have studied them. The subjects in the university have to be revolutionized from within. There is no other way of adjusting them to changes and advances in knowledge, and it is far more important for each subject to be intelligible to itself than for the different subjects to be intelligible to one another. Nobody can work out a master plan to make the student understand the relations of geology to physics, but the subject of geophysics will take its own form from those relations. The attempt to give the university student a kind of perspective on what the whole of the learned human race has done and is doing is often bound up with the desire to formulate the beliefs or the aims or the purposes of a democratic society. We are often told that we suffer from a disadvantage as compared with communism in not having a set of clearly defined statements which say what we believe about society and constitute our vision of it. There is still some danger, though less than there was a few years ago, to put social pressure on universities to force them to work out and teach some kind of democratic philosophy. What kind does not matter too much as long as it is sufficiently anti-communist. It seems to me the essence of democracy that such things should be left undefined, and that individual subjects, however difficult and esoteric, should be left to themselves. Every science is the queen of sciences, or, if it is a new science, a pawn that may become a queen. Whether the universe is pluralistic or not, there is no doubt that the world of the intellect is. In approaching the problem of the relation of the university to a democratic society, I think we need a radically different point of view. I start with the fact that there are two levels on which the reason may be employed. There is a speculative level and there is a practical level. The speculative level is that of the knowledge of the objective world. On this level, the great virtues are detachment, impartiality, and suspension of judgment. The university teaches on this level, and to the extent that the university is a moral as well as an intellectual influence, these are the moral qualities it appeals to. This kind of thinking consists in identifying oneself with a body of thought so that one then becomes capable of adding something to it. There is no thinking on this level apart from such identification with a specific discipline. Thinking is not a natural process like eating or sleeping, nor a process centered in the personality like social behavior. It is an impersonal skill, developed by habit and practice, like playing the piano. On the level of practical intelligence, on the other hand, man is a citizen of a society, and here the relevant categories are not so much truth and falsehood as freedom and necessity. On this level, the human being, as a member of a society, is first of all engaged or committed, and his intelligence on this level expresses itself primarily in the making of a choice. This is a kind of intelligence that Milton was thinking of when he said in Areopagitica that reason is but choosing. Moral as well as intellectual qualities are also different on this level. Here, the personality is involved, and conflict may become personal. In a crisis, the bad argument may turn into the bad man. If a person is maintaining views about white supremacy and the inherent inferiority of the colored races, we do not say that he is using syllogisms illogically. We say that he is sick. We do not feel impelled to argue. We merely feel impelled to say, what is the matter with a man who feels compelled to argue in this way? Suppose, for example, that some ambitious Canadian McCarthy were to try to build a career out of spreading slander and hysteria. Undoubtedly, many Canadians have already conditioned themselves to climb on the bandwagon of such a person as soon as he opens his mouth. On the level of practical intelligence, what is demanded of the educated person is not the ability to see facts as they are, but the courage to fight. Whoever pretends that on this level there is still room for detachment and impartiality is merely rationalizing his own cowardice. It is not difficult in practice to see how the same problems reshape themselves on these different levels of intelligence. I remember attending a meeting of social scientists a while ago and listening, as I always do in such discussions, to the metaphors. I realized that the mood was fairly cool because the metaphors were mechanical. They were talking about cooperating and adjusting and dealing with breakdowns. I realized that if they were more concerned about their subject, they would start using organic or medical metaphors and talk in terms of health and sickness. If they were still more deeply concerned, moral conceptions of good and bad would creep in. And if they were discussing something like the Nazi persecution of Jews, they would be compelled to go one step further into religious metaphors. They might have no explicit religious views of their own, but they could not avoid speaking and thinking of such things as being under the judgment of God. What I have been revolving around in the last few minutes is the problem described in the famous Reed lecture, C.P. Snow's The Problem of the Two Cultures, the humanist's ignorance of science, and the scientist's ignorance of the humanities. I have tried to suggest why I do not think this a major problem in our society. It is not the humanist's ignorance of science or the scientist's ignorance of the humanities which is important, but their common ignorance of the society that they are living in, and of their responsibilities as citizens. It is not the humanist's inability to read a textbook in physics, or the physicist's inability to read a textbook in literary criticism, but the inability of both of them to read the morning paper with a kind of insight which is demanded of educated citizens. You are doubtless familiar with the book of Robert Jungk, Brighter Than 1,000 Suns, the story behind the lives of the scientists who made the atom bomb. The book begins in a kind of academic paradise at the University of Göttingen in Germany, where they were living in a state of intellectual ferment and high excitement, yet oblivious to the fact that the greatest concentration of evil and malice that the world had ever seen was slowly gathering in the society around them. They were utterly bewildered when they found themselves refugees in Denmark, and in reading the remainder of the book one hardly knows which to wonder at more, their brilliance as scientists or their chuckle-headedness as citizens. The practical sense is obviously central in the process of education, but as it cannot be directly taught, it is at best a byproduct of university training, and not something that the university specifically aims at, apart from the fact that it can be held quite as firmly by people outside the university. The question next arises of where the practical sense is derived from, that is, where one gets the power to make choices in the interests of one's freedom. The easiest answer is in adjustment to society itself, but that clearly is a wrong answer because society changes very rapidly. Rapid change breeds hysteria, and adjustment to rapid change merely breeds more of it. In a book which many of you may have seen, The Gutenberg Galaxy, Professor Marshall McLuhan speaks of contemporary society as a post-literate society. That is a society which has gone through a phase of identifying knowledge with the written word and is now gaining its knowledge from all kinds of other media which affect the ear as well as the eye. The ability to twitch ears is the mark of the animal, which is constantly exposed to danger, and Mr. McLuhan is well aware of the extent to which the increase in such media brings with it an increase in panic. He quotes one or two examples of panic in contemporary writers, including some very intellectually respectable ones, and remarks, "Terror is a normal state of an oral society, because everything is happening to everyone all the time." The sense of panic is occasionally rationalized on the level of practical intelligence itself, by people who speak of commitment as though it were a virtue in itself. Don't just stand there, get yourself committed. This is the attitude which was described many years ago by H.G. Wells as the attitude of the God-sakers, the people who continually say, "For God's sake, let's do something." No, we need a better answer to the question of what the source of the authority of the practical intelligence is. One possible answer is that it is derived from some kind of overall vision of society. Every person with any function in society at all will have some kind of ideal vision of that society in the light of which he operates. One can hardly imagine a social worker going out to do casework without thinking of her as having, somewhere in her mind, a vision of a better, cleaner, healthier, more emotionally balanced city, as a kind of mental model inspiring the work she does. One can hardly imagine, in fact, any professional person not having such a social model, a world of health for the doctor or of justice for the judge. Nor would such a social vision be confined to the professions. It seems to me, in fact, that a utopia should be conceived not as an impossible dream of an impossible ideal, but as the kind of working model of society that exists somewhere in the mind of every sane person who has any social function at all. At the end of Plato's Republic, Socrates, after having described his ideal state, asks his disciples if they think that any such state could ever be established. Those who had not, by the 9th book, either gone to sleep or fallen under the table, say that they suppose not. Socrates then says that he doesn't either, but that the wise man will always live as though he were a citizen of such a community, no matter what the society around him actually is. Very frequently, however, such social visions become the basis of revolutionary activity. This is why, as I said earlier, I distrust the tendency to define social ideals too explicitly, because to define a social vision is to make that curious identifying of religious and secular feelings that is characteristic of the revolutionary mind, especially today in the attitude of communism. Communism has no God, but that does not prevent it from being a religion with prophets, revealed scriptures, a body of infallible doctrine, heresies, saints, martyrs, and shrines. Such a religious attitude results from its defined conception of social change. It is obvious that our own time is a revolutionary one, and the communist countries spend a good deal of their time and energy arguing about which is the correct form of revolution. That is the issue which divides them whenever Russia expresses its disagreement with China by abusing Albania. There are two possible attitudes to social change. One is to think of the revolution which has happened, once and for all, in some countries and is going to happen in others. The other is to think of our society as in a constant state of change and try to deal with it accordingly with the flexibility which that fact demands. The latter seems to me the view of social change that we are committed to in the democracies. I have a slightly different answer to the question of where the origin of the practical intelligence is. The fact that we are living in a revolutionary age means that the society around us is not real society at all, but the transient appearance of that society. The students going to college now were born into a world in which the king was emperor of India, in which China was a friend and Japan an enemy, and in which Nazi Germany ruled the most powerful empire that the world had ever seen. It is obvious that the 20th century middle-class Canadian society we belong to is too transient and too fitful in its manifestations to be regarded as real society at all. I think the real society that man lives in is the society which is revealed to him by the arts and the sciences with which his education brings him into contact. The goal of education is social, an initiation into the form of human society that won't go away and will not have disappeared within the next generation. It is this vision of society which operates as a kind of informing vision in human activities, as the vision of Plato's Republic is supposed to do for the disciples of Socrates. I suggest that the simplest way to characterize that informing vision of society is to identify it with the university itself, with that total body of arts and sciences which, in their totality, are the real form of society and into which the student is initiated. And yet, I have also said, the university as an institution of teaching and research cannot go beyond the speculative level of knowledge, where thought consists in identifying one's mind with a specific and highly specialized discipline. This is why it is so important to understand how much in university education must be left to student initiative. In the universities of the immediate future, the student's problem, despite all the limitations that universities will be forced to put up, will be not so much the difficulty of getting to college as making sure that when he gets there he will be educated and not merely processed. In the nature of things, no instructor, however deeply interested in students, can take the initiative in this. The student must cultivate all the virtues of education, and the virtues of education are mainly social vices. He must become antisocial. He must make an unmitigated pest of himself in sitting on his professor's doorstep armed with questions. He should have the kind of maladjusted unpleasantness that goes with the genuine student's mentality. When a good student displays arrogance, it often means that he is pulling away from the kind of well-adjusted social behavior that leads to security, popularity, and the death of the free mind. Such antisocial qualities may be forced out of a keen student by the sense that unless he develops some form of intellectual resistance, he will be, in university as elsewhere, merely sliding by smoothly on a kind of assembly line. I should hope, too, that the university of the future, however much it had to offer intellectually, would not be reserved for professional students only. Restricting the university to students of a certain academic standing may often be necessary, but is too simple to be a total solution to the problem of admission. I should prefer to see the university continue to be what it is now, something of a cross-section of the more intelligent and well-meaning part of the community at large. It is also, or should be, a more heterogeneous community than the student has been accustomed to. In Canada, to give one obvious example, it is a place where students from Africa and Asia can mingle in Canadian life more easily than they can anywhere else. At present, the university is a center of scholarship and research, also concerned with the liberal and professional training of young people in their later adolescence, much of the most bewildered and bemused period of their lives. Perhaps the next century, as society develops more leisure with automation, will see the university expanding its relation to society and less monopolized as a teaching institution by the routine of granting degrees. I can envisage an ideal university which would be a community which a person could enter at any time in his life, as, say, an adult with grown-up children, as both a retreat and as a place of study in which an accumulation of practical experience could be brought to bear on academic training. A university in this expanded sense would be the institution of the theory of society as opposed to practical society. It would be the clearinghouse of cultural and intellectual pursuits, in fact the embodiment of Matthew Arnold's culture, which for Arnold was not merely the ornamenting of life, but the source of all genuine order and stability in our civilization.